We want to give a big thank you to Jensen Hughes, who is sponsor of uh, the chapter overall, also this program, and our speaker today, who will introduce himself, Joshua Kleiber.
Hello, everybody. Let me share my screen and pop this up. Hopefully, everybody can see that introductory slide.
Looks good.
Great, thank you. My name is Joshua Kleiber. I am Principal of Accessibility and Universal Design at Jensen Hughes for the Pacific Northwest. Some of you may have known us under our prior incarnation of the name of a company was called Code Unlimited. And we're kind of like the Northwest portion of Jensen Hughes at this point. Beyond just doing accessibility and code compliance in the Pacific Northwest, head up universal design for the United States and do some code development and consulting up in Canada as well. Yeah. Part of a larger international firm where you got people everywhere. So no matter where you're working in the United States or in the world, we can assist you with it. That's enough about me and the company. All right. Let's get started with this then. I'm going to throw up some pictures on the right-hand side every now and then. Accessibility can be a little bit dry, a little bit boring, according to some. I personally find it really exciting and powerful way of doing social justice work in the world and caring for those who need more assistance. But in order to lighten this up, these pictures on the right are classic accessibility fails that we see in the field. Yeah, laugh, learn, don't do those things. The tour for today, doing the introduction, questions. If you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat and I will monitor the chat. If you could hold those questions to be specific to the topic at hand. So that means related to the topic that we're talking about at that point in time. If they're project specific or they're a bit of a tangent, let's hold them to one of the kind of transitions between different sections. And I can address some of those at that point in time. This is going to be the full tour agenda. We're talking about the scoping of the different standards. So which codes do you apply? Which codes do you apply to publicly funded housing and some of the specifics around that. Talk about the basic concepts, otherwise known as the building blocks. And we'll get into public bathrooms. At that point, we'll take a break. That should be around noon, 11:30 or so. And we'll take a break until noon. And then we'll get back into more kind of specific residential bathrooms, going over kitchens, both residential and public. Talk about a couple slides on outlets over counters because it comes up on every single multifamily project. And then the last hour will be just a quick introduction to universal design. And at the very end, answering more questions if needed. What does this not include? I find this also very helpful. We're not going to be talking about existing buildings. That gets a lot significantly more complicated and more nuanced. It is dependent on the specific building that we're talking about and the condition that they're in. We're not going to be talking about transient lodging, whether that is permanent, not permanent supportive housing, but homeless shelters or hotels. We're not going to be discussing anything with a public right of way because that is an entirely different set of standards than what is applicable to within the project site. I should probably change this a little bit. The 2022 OSC, I'm going to mention a little tiny bit, just a couple of the accessibility changes. The 2017 A117 is kind of baked through this entire thing, but I'm not going to be addressing all the significant changes. I'll point them out kind of where they come up. I've highlighted them in red font, but not addressing that change in standards specifically. Also, I'm going to be talking about a lot of these kind of specialized conditions. I'll mention children's elements such as children's toilet heights, things like that, but I'm not going to go into detail. There are other specific requirements around restaurants, assembly spaces, healthcare. Yeah, if you do have questions about those, I'd be happy to answer them towards the end of the presentation. All right, I'm going to get into scoping of accessibility standards. The biggest thing about accessibility standards is understanding the difference between federal standards and state standards. And I will kind of reiterate that all the way through this kind of first like half hour, 45 minutes, where we're talking about that. I'm going to go through most of the applicable standards and discuss when and where they should be applied. If you have choices, what choices we recommend and kind of what factors go into that choice. Specifically around safe harbors, that always comes up as a question. I'm also going to talk about some of these spaces that might be a little bit confusing about which codes to apply. This happens a lot in multifamily. Are you applying public standards? Are you applying the safe harbors that are regulated by HUD? Are you applying both? Talk a bit about that and employee work areas. One of those other everyone's favorite exemption for accessibility, and really kind of clarifying what's required. All right. So this is going to be the main table that I use all the way through this particular section to kind of help clarify. Once again, be very aware of what are federal standards versus what are state standards. I'm not sure which states everyone works in. So I've kind of highlighted certain states that are a little bit different from everyone else. The California does not use the A117.1. Instead, it relies solely on their chapters 11A and 11B, 11A being residential, 11B being public, and also public housing. Note that there's some new 2024 internet updates that are going into effect July 1st, so please be aware of those. Massachusetts has its own code. Texas doesn't apply anything to residential. Florida, it's a little bit weird as well. And then there's also several states out there that don't have any residential code, and they just reference the FHA and the ADA. And so they're basically taking these federal standards and making them state standards. But those are the outliers. Oregon and Washington will be completely covered by what we're talking about today. Hawaii to some extent as well. Idaho too. Okay, we'll go through each of these standards. So 2009 A117.1 is still in use up in Washington at this point in time. It will soon be changing. They're going through the amendment process right now. This is not applicable in Oregon at this point in time, except for projects that are pretty late in construction. You still might be using 2009 version. But anything that's on the books right now or on the boards right now and is being submitted should be using the 2017 version. Once again, California uses 11A and 11B. This is the A117 is the state technical standard referenced by the IBC that 45 of the states of the 50 states use. This is the 2017 version. This is the one that's current in Oregon, current in Montana. It's originally was supposed to come in July 1st, 2023. Obviously, they're about a year and a half behind in that schedule. Not really sure why. Hawaii, at this point, they're on the 2018 IBC, which references the old 2009 version. I'm not sure when they're planning on updating next. They tend to be on a very long update cycle. Idaho is planning on adopting the 2024 IBC in 2026. There's a lot of dates. But at this point, Idaho is still on the 2009, not yet on the 2017. All right, now we're getting into the federal codes. So everyone knows the ADA. ADA is quite often used as a synonym for being accessible, say like an ADA unit as compared to an accessible unit, or is it ADA compliant, meaning is it compliant with all like state and federal standards. So be careful when tossing out the term ADA. The ADA actually is the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is just the federal law. When a lot of people refer to the ADAS, they're actually referring to the 2010 ADA Standards for Accessible Design, or the ADAS. Those are the technical standards that you want to be taking a look at. Key thing about this is that it applies to all areas of public accommodation. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that when we get into the what are those different areas within a multifamily residential complex as an example of explaining what public accommodation means. There are a few notable exceptions to the ADA. It is not applicable to any religious facility in the United States. It's also not applicable to private clubs, though deciding what a private club is, it can be a little bit tricky sometimes. It's also not applicable to any residential only areas. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. What does apply to the residential areas is the Fair Housing Act. Similar to the ADA, where the ADA is the federal act that was passed by Congress, the Fair Housing Act is a very simple little document passed by but wide, critically important, wide-ranging implications. But it's a small document published by Congress. What most people think of as like, are you FHA compliant? Typically, a lot of people will think of the FHA design manual. That's kind of parallel to the ADA and the ADA standards. Talk a little bit more about the safe harbors in a slide or two. Key things to know about the Fair Housing Act: it is applicable to any area that is accessed by residents and their guests. So not only does this include the residential units, but also the residential amenities, such as like an exterior pool or a mail room or a leasing office within a residential complex. Other things to note: any building built before March 13th, 1991 does not have to comply with the Fair Housing Act. There is a little bit of nuance, especially if it was designed and permitted around that time, about when it was first occupied and what does it mean to be first occupied. That's some nuance I'm not going to get into today. Also, if it was not built initially as a long-term residence, it's also exempt from the FHA. So, for example, you have a hotel that was originally built as transient housing, but is being converted into a set of condos. That would be exempt from the FHA because it was not built originally as long-term housing. All your standard like Soho lofts, where that were previous industrial district and building, the art lofts in New York City, those also exempt. So any of those building conversions. Also, if you have a triplex or less, so 1 and 2 family homes or a triplex, that individual building is also going to be exempt from FHA. I got a slide a little bit later within the next like 5-10 slides that will kind of explore a lot of this idea a little bit more about the differences between a 3-plex and a 4-plex and which ones, how you apply FHA to which of those types of buildings. So this is the federal residential code. In order to comply with the FHA, you have to comply with what they call a safe harbor. And a safe harbor is a standard. If you follow it, it demonstrates that you are fully in compliance with the Fair Housing Act. And there are about, I never remember the number, I think it's like 15 or 16. Oh, I see a question. I can, oh, somebody was saying it's hard to hear on the speaker, and I will speak a little bit louder. Thank you, Jim. I will do that. So there's a list of about 15 or 16 different safe harbors or different standards. Most of them are out of date. Say, like, for example, the 1986 version of the A117.1. For the most part, there's 3 or 4 that are commonly in use. We highly recommend that everyone use the 2018 IBC as the safe harbor. If you're in a state that's using 2018 IBC as the state code, then by meeting state code, you automatically satisfy the Fair Housing Act. If you're in a state such as Oregon, which has been updated to be based on the 2021 IBC, it's not that big of a jump to go from the 2018 to the 2021 version. There's just a few little things that you need to know. I would recommend against using the 2009 A117.1 as a safe harbor because it does not contain any scoping. Just for everyone's clarification, scoping tells you how many, if, when things need to be accessible. The technical standards tells you how to be accessible. Great example is bathrooms. So scoping would tell you, oh, 50% of your clustered bathrooms need to be accessible. Technical standards would tell you, oh, you have to have the grab bars of this height, you need to have your toilet 18 inches off the wall, that kind of information. Because that A117.1 is only a technical standard, the question then comes in is, where do you get that scoping from? And you would have to go back to the Fair Housing Act itself. And since it's so simple, it's a little bit vague. It's really open to a lot of interpretation. Some designers really like that, but it's not so great when you get a complaint and being able to defend yourself against something that's so vague. It gets a little bit tricky. The other big one besides the 2018 IBC is going to be the 1998 FHA Design Manual. It's been in use for about 30 years. It is very commonly used. A lot of people really like it. I personally think it's a horrible standard. It's old, it's out of date. There's a lot of, I don't know, a lot. There are what I consider self-contradictions within it. Yes. One of the other kind of not so great things about the FHADM, if you really want to do a deep dive into it, all the public areas of that safe harbor require you to be in compliant with the 1986 version of the A117.1. So if you want to be strict and literal compliance with FHADM, all of your stairways in your building will need to have not only the 12-inch horizontal extension, but also a tread depth. So you have to go a tread depth plus 12 inches. You have to provide handrails at a certain height. So it's measured to the end, which actually conflicts with the current A117.1. And so it's actually impossible to meet both the FHADM for common areas and the state code at this point in time. There's all these little details that if you want to be strict adherence that you actually miss. Key things to note, the 2021 IBC, the current version of IBC that a lot of jurisdictions are using, and the 2017 version are not yet adopted as safe harbors. HUD has promised that they're going to be a little bit quicker about adopting new safe harbors. though the last update took about 10 years. So I have no idea when these two kind of current state standards are going to be adopted. All right, some of the lesser known standards. There's the Architectural Barriers Act. If you are working on a federal facility, so whether it's owned, leased, or operated by a federal facility, you have to apply the ABA as compared to the ADA. The technical standards are identical to the ADA, but the scoping is slightly different. So pay attention to that. I'm not going to go into the ABA scoping at all during this presentation. That's a little too specific. I'm not sure how many of you work on federal facilities. The other federal standard that we do interact with a little bit more is something known as the Uniform Federal Accessibility Standard, or UFAS, or UFAS, depending on how you pronounce it. This is also for federally funded, owned, and operated projects, but it applies to the residential portions, where the ABA applies to the public accommodation portion. So like offices, federal offices. UFAS is not only applicable to federally operated housing, such as BLM housing, housing at national parks would be under UFAS. But it also applies to any kind of affordable housing funding program that is receiving money from HUD. In 2014, HUD released something known as the deeming notice. That's what that link is in the middle of the slide. Basically saying, I'm going to paraphrase a little bit, basically saying you don't have to use UFAS, but instead you can use the ADAS with 11 exceptions. I highly recommend that you don't use UFAS anymore. That is even older than the FHADM. UFAS has not been updated since 1988. It is a little bit more relaxed in some ways. The reach range was 54 inches instead of 48 inches high, but there are some hidden things in there that are a lot more restrictive. Handrail heights on stairs, once again. For another, the extensions on handrails, you have to do a tread depth plus your 12 inches rather than just your 12 inches. You have to put the accessible international symbol of accessibility at every single accessible entrance. And yeah, a lot of people don't really like that. So there's things in UFAS that are kind of older, and I would recommend that you don't do. Instead, use the ADAS with the 11 exceptions for all projects that are receiving federal public funding from HUD. All right, so I'm using this multifamily residential complex as an example of how to apply the different scoping in. And it can get a little complicated, especially given the complicated complexes. So if you happen to have a variety of building types, say a 4-story building with an elevator and 16 units, how do you know which codes are applicable? Just as a quick summary, the FHA is not applicable to any project that has 3 or less units, so 1, 2, or 3 units in it. So that's going to be about 4 of the examples in here. The FHA is not going to be applicable to. Also, I'll just go to the next slide. So 4-story building with an elevator and 16 units, all units, you have to apply FHADM because it has more than 4 stories, and the A117.1 because that's state code. If you have a 2-story walk-up with 2 units, you don't have to have any accessible requirements at all because it's now under the residential code rather than the commercial code. 2-story walk-up with 3 units, because it's only 3 units, you don't have to apply the FHA-DM, but it's a walk-up, and so you have 1 unit on the ground floor, a couple of units upstairs. You would only have to apply the state code to the bottom floor. So you have to take each of these buildings and analyze it per the scoping requirements or the applicability requirements of each of those different standards. And it can get a little complicated, and you have to do it on a building by building basis. It's not as the complex as a whole. When you get into multifamily spaces, multifamily residential, it can get a little complicated as to which codes apply to which spaces within the facility. So I'm going to talk about the left and the right, and then we'll go into the middle. So on the left, we have public spaces. So what are the public space areas of the multifamily residential complex where a public is kind of enters? Leasing office, the mail room, the lobby, and if you happen to have any commercial tenants within it. Let's do that there for now. Going into the other, on the right hand side, if you go into the dwelling units, there are a whole bunch of different types of different dwelling units. Here's a quick list of them. I'm going to go over them a little bit more when we get to the residential section of this presentation, but those are all the different ones that I'm aware of. The ADA is not applicable inside of these dwelling units unless you're getting public funding for federal, well, yeah, I suppose it's federal or state public funding. So the middle is where it gets a little bit more confusing. What about these semi-public spaces or amenity spaces like exercise pool rooms, pools, dog washes? Are those accessible by the public, or are they only for residents and their guests, or is it both public and residents? And generally, we recommend that you apply both and assume that there will be public access to any of the amenity rooms. This allows a lot more flexibility for the use of that space. So, for example, on tour day, where you're giving tours to public or to potential lessees of the exercise room, that is public access to that exercise room when you're giving a tour. Or, for example, you want to, the homeowners association wants to have a fundraiser, and they're throwing a pool party for the neighborhood with like food and a bake sale, and the kids can access the pool during the bake sale. That's public access. By designing these semi-public or amenity spaces to meet the ADA, you allow that flexibility in use. And it's not that significant a stretch. Probably the biggest one is going to be your kitchens. Well, it'll have the most effect, and potentially a pool as well with your pool lift. All right, employee work areas. An employee work area is where work is performed. That's one of the key things to it. So this does not include break rooms, lounges, or kind of amenity kitchens. So like if you have a typical office building that has like a kitchenette in the office, so that way people can go and sit and eat lunch and prepare food. That break room, that kitchen, is not where work is being performed. That is an amenity for the employees. They're not paid to make food for themselves for lunch. Where it can get a little bit different is, say, for example, you have a daycare where it is the responsibility of the daycare provider to prepare food for the children that are attending the daycare. That preparation of food within that kitchen is part of the duties, employable duties of that daycare worker, and therefore that is considered work. However, these spaces usually double as the break rooms for the teachers. So that way they can just go and have a private time while they're having lunch. And if it doubles as both a break room and a work kitchen, then you have to apply the you are not able to apply the sixth section. So what's required for an employee work area? You have to have an accessible entry and exit from the work area. This is a matter of some debate within the accessibility community. You clearly need to have the door maneuvering clearance on the outside, as shown on the picture on the right. The debate comes up is, do you need to have the door maneuvering clearance on the inside in order for someone to exit the work area? The middle ground where I personally tend to settle is that if it is a work area that is deeper than 48 inches, such that a wheelchair can get in, it's probably better to provide an ability for that person to turn around and to be able to, so 60-inch clearance or 67-inch clearance, depending on which code you're using, and for them to be able to open that door in order to get back out. So you have to have door maneuvering clearance on the inside as well. It's better, but that is up for some interpretation. What definitely is required, you need to at least have a 30 by 48 beyond the door if it is deeper than 48 inches. One other thing, within a work area, all the elements are exempt. So workstations, light switches, outlets, desks, all of your standard elements within that work area are completely exempt from accessibility requirements. The only thing that might be required is an accessible route through that work area. So that accessible route is required unless, and there's 3 different conditions, that the area of that work area is 1,000 square feet. And that might be a couple of rooms with a door in between, and you can kind of lump those 2 different work rooms together, and both of them are less than 1,000 square feet. So that door in between those 2 rooms would not be required to be accessible at all. The route is integral to the equipment. This is a really hard one to kind of implement. The place I see it most common is going to be in heavy manufacturing, such as in fabs or places that have large boilers, conveyor belts, things like that, where the route is kind of associated going in and out of the equipment. Or exterior work areas don't need to have accessible routes. So, for example, you have a lumber yard. You don't necessarily need to have accessible routes through that lumber yard if it's employees only. One other quick thing to differentiate, employee work areas are not mechanical rooms. So your IDF, MDF, sprinklerizer rooms, boiler rooms, things like that, where it's a mechanical space that is accessed only for maintenance. That is not a work area that has a separate exemption and are not required to be accessible. All right, that is the first section on generally how to apply the various accessibility standards to most projects. This section is going to be specifically about publicly funded housing, because that gets a lot more complicated. Are there any questions at all at this point about scoping? Wait for a second, see if anything pops up in the chat. Okay, so let's go on to publicly funded housing. So for those of you who were at the AIA Oregon Design Conference that was in Bend, was it 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago now? You may have already seen this section, but I'm going to rehash it here for those who have not yet seen it. What is public housing? I actually want to switch that to public funding. Public housing historically has been known as like the projects. I got a picture on the right is an example from, I think it's either Manhattan or Brooklyn, of some tenements, probably Brooklyn. And the it's they don't really look like this anymore. And it's most of the time the municipalities or federal government don't really operate housing such as this anymore. They may operate smaller versions of this. They try to blend in with the community at this point. But for the most part, public housing is operated by third-party entities. The other thing I want to change is, so the change idea is that because it's not operated by the city, what is more critical is knowing what is the funding source for that. Anytime that you get city or federal funding, it's going to trigger ADA Title II. I'm going to go into this a little bit more in detail as we go along. Yeah. So here are some examples of different types of publicly funded housing projects. So we get low-income housing or affordable housing, transitional housing, sometimes known as permanent supportive housing. We also get the transient shelters that gets affected by ADA Title II, and then we get receiving public funding, alcohol drug rehab. Probably one of the lesser known ones is public universities. So any housing that is owned and operated by a public university is also considered publicly funded. This not only includes the dorms, but also the fraternities and sororities. Got to be a little bit careful about that, because some of those fraternities and sororities are independently operated as a private club, and therefore ADA is not applicable to it. But some of these are actually owned by the university itself, but operated independently. In that case, you do have to apply it not because that it's a private club, but because of the funding and ownership of the building itself. One of the key things to this, and we're going to get a little bit more into detail on this as well, is how do you know that funding is being provided for this particular project? And the key phrase I always go back to is cash money. Is there cash money being provided to support the construction of this project? And it's not necessarily, and that construction has to be for affordable or low income or transitional housing, one of these kind of intents of what the housing is for. And I'll get a little bit more into that about like some examples of what is not considered public funding. All right. Some of it also depends on where that money is coming from. If it is coming from HUD, then that cash money is coming from HUD, not a loan, not tax credits, not mortgage insurance, but it's cash money, either in the form of a grant or a subsidy. It's coming from HUD, and then it triggers something called Section 504. And it's Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. Be careful, because each federal department has their own Section 504. So there's HUD Section 504, there's Department of Energy 504, Health and Human Services 504, Department of Agriculture 504. HUD is the one that is most developed and most widely known. That's the technical reference for Section 504.29 of the U.S. State Code, Section 794, if you ever want to look it up. It's a dense read. Only the really dedicated people might want to really look at that. Little side note, HUD Section 504 also applies to not only housing, but also education, healthcare, parks, social services, because they fund a whole bunch of other things besides housing, kind of these corollary services. Going back into the forms of that HUD funding, grants. Oh, I need to cross out loans. Sorry, I didn't do that. I will do that before I send out the PDF of the slideshow. Going back to that cash money, grants are considered providing that cash money to the developer. Loans are not. That should be crossed out by mistake. But also tax credits and mortgage insurance are not providing that cash money to the developer. It's other forms of benefits that enable them to build a little bit easier, get larger loans, save money on the back end from the IRS. But that's not actually providing that cash money. The picture on the right is actually public funded housing. I just wanted to kind of throw it out there and just kind of change the image of what public housing looks like. This is a 1980s project, and I think it was I don't know if it's Key West, somewhere down in Florida. All right. Getting into the specific programs that might trigger HUD Section 504, this is just if you run across these names, Section 212, 212 or 202. I think it's 212. Supportive housing for the elderly. I run across this every now and then. There's support Section 811. Supportive housing for the disabled. I have never seen this funding. I don't know if this program is still active or not, but it's on the list. Let me know if you've actually worked on a project with this funding stream. Section 8, you have to be a little bit careful about. There's two versions of Section 8. The better known are the Section 8 vouchers, or the tenant program, the tenant vouchers, in which a potential prospective tenant might get a voucher, and they give that voucher to a landlord or an apartment management company, and then that discounts their rent. There's a form of discounting their rent. Those vouchers are attached to the tenant and are not attached to a particular project, and so they do not trigger HUD Section 504. There is another version, less known, in which the owner of the building gets a subsidy to discount the rent on particular units. The difference is that the money is attached to that individual unit and not the tenant. That Section 8 program, when it's project-based or attached to the units, does trigger HUD Section 504. A couple other ones: community development block grants, home funds. Those also trigger Section 504. You should also be careful, because a lot of these federal money programs get funneled through a state agency, whether that is in Oregon, it's the Oregon Housing and Community Services, OHCS. I'll talk a little bit more about them in a little bit. Through Washington, I believe it goes through the Department of Finance. Can't remember the name of the department. But it may appear as if it's coming from a state agency, but is actual federal money. So be careful with that. When you do trigger HUD Section 504, this is where the UFIS gets triggered. Please don't use UFIS. It's old, it's out of date. There's a lot of little things in there that most people are not aware of. Let me once again give that example of handrails. UFIS says that the handrails have to be a minimum of 36 inches high in stairwells, where 36 of the I was getting handrails and grab bars confused. Anyways, UFIS states that the minimum height for a handrail is the same as the maximum height under the A117.1. And so in order to satisfy both, you have to hit your handrail at an exact height with no tolerance on all stairwells. You also have to do that handrail extension of 1 tread depth plus 12 inches, which gets a little bit tricky in your stairwells. And how does that affect the egress and the dormitory clearance at that exit discharge door? So instead of using UFIS, rely on HUD's deeming notice. This is an actual, this is a screenshot of where it's at. I sent the link on an earlier slide. Came out in 2014. So at this point, it's 10 years old. You should have been able to use the ADAS with the 11 exceptions for 10 years now. A lot of state agencies are a little bit slow and they still expect people to use UFIS. Please educate them, saying you don't have to anymore. So what are the 11 exceptions under the HUD section 504? This is a list of all 11 of them, the summary of all 11 of them. Most of them apply to either steeply sloped sites or existing buildings. One thing, please do not, try not to work on or try not to locate public housing or publicly funded housing on steeply sloped sites. It gets really hard because you can't use a bunch of the exceptions that are within the ADAS. If you are doing an existing building, that's a lot rarer to get public funding for a renovation of a building. Take a look at more specifically at these exceptions. There's only two that regularly come up on new construction of publicly funded housing, and I'm going to address those. First one is employee work areas. So that entire discussion about employee work areas and about everyone's favorite exception, you can't use it in publicly funded housing. All employee work areas must be fully accessible. This includes the back of house areas. The harder part on the upper floor is going to be janitorial closets. So that means that you have to have an accessible mop sink. What does that look like? And you have to have accessible trash rooms. So the dumpsters in your trash rooms in publicly funded housing have to be accessible. And good luck trying to find a dumpster that fits within the 48-inch high reach range. In California, where everything is a lot more strict, they will quite often put a ramp in behind the dumpsters. So that way it has an elevated landing. So that way that height of the dumpster drops to less than 48 inches above the walking surface. Here in Oregon, it's not really done. Or Washington, it's not really done. And I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide, about enforcement and what do you have to really pay attention to. And once again, I want to differentiate employee work areas from mechanical, electrical, telecom, sprinkler rooms. Those are exempted under maintenance spaces or maintenance only access. The other one is going to be laundry machines. And this is not necessarily going to be within the units, but in the common areas. According to ADAS, you need to either have, it's not 5%, it's either 1 or 2 accessible laundry machines, depending on how many are provided. But under the 11 exceptions, all machines have to be within the reach range. What this means is that, according to the picture on the right, you're not allowed to have stacked laundry machines. That is not compliant in public housing. Also, you can't have top loading, but doing all front loading is pretty standard nowadays. So I want to address enforcement. So one of the big questions is, okay, so you get public funding. Say you happen to have stacked laundry machines on the right, or you have dumpsters that are not fully accessible. Who's enforcing that? Who's looking for that? Theoretically, it's going to be the people that are distributing the funds. So whether that's HUD or your state agency. Completely off the record, I know this is being recorded, but off the record, I've had conversations with a man named Rex Pace, who is currently head of kind of architectural requirements for HUD and kind of oversees some of the enforcement or has a big influence on the enforcement. And I asked them specifically about stacked laundry because in order for it to be compliant, you're removing approximately half of the laundry machines in this facility. Who does that really benefit when you're removing half the machines, but in order to make it compliant? I mean, you're not really benefiting anybody. And his response was, Yeah, we kind of ignore things like that. HUD is going to go after anybody that is willfully uh, not complying with the code in like a major systemic sort of way. Or they go after these 1950 buildings that have huge amounts of deferred maintenance. Ceilings are caving in, mold, water is flowing to all the units, the um, fire alarms and sprinkler heads aren't working or been painted over, egress issues, doors are being propped, that kind of stuff. Whereas a major concern for people's life safety, not that, oh, are you compliant with the code and making people's lives harder by not providing as many laundry machines? So I can't tell you to install stacked laundry, but I can also tell you it's probably not going to be an issue at all, as told to me by the head of HUD, the head of HUD, the head of a department of HUD. And that's why we don't see it so much up here in Oregon, Washington. In California, it's a whole different issue because there's a financial incentive for finding non-compliant issues. Okay, I mentioned OHCS. So that was all about federal funding. Be careful because some of that federal funding does go through a state agency in Oregon. It's the Oregon Housing and Community Services. OHCS tacks on additional accessibility requirements. So you got to be aware of that. Be careful of that. So if you're getting federal funds going through OHCS, or if you're getting state funding that is originating from OHCS, they quite often tack on something called the Core Development Manual. It used to be called the CDP. I don't remember what the P stands for. Maybe it's Core Development Program. But that Core Development Manual does have some additional requirements that you have to be aware of when you're designing a building. It also triggers ORS 456.541, which is visibility for units. I'll talk about that in a second as well. OHCS being run by Kevin Burgee. He is our state architect. Basically, it's his responsibility for managing the accessibility and physical built environment requirements for these publicly funded projects around the state. He's super nice, polite, very flexible, understanding. If you can't meet some of these OHCS requirements that are in the CDM, you can email him and ask for a variance, and he's very amenable for that. Why would you want a variance? Because some of them get a little tricky. The Core Development Manual, here are some key accessibility provisions that are within it. There is a checklist for new construction and also for renovation. Oop, I see a couple of questions. Yes, you will get a copy of these slides at the end of the show. Has anyone ever received a formal approval of variance? You get email approval from Kevin Burgee at OHCS. I don't know if that's what is considered formal. That's what most people get, and it happens all the time. Specifically around the sizes of units. Yep. Oh, another question. Nope. Oh, you've emailed Kevin and he hasn't responded. All right. That's good to know. Interesting. Okay. I will take that into account and I don't know what to say about that. Most of the clients that I've worked with have emailed him and gotten those variance responses. If he doesn't respond, I suppose that's a consent by non-response, I suppose. I'm not sure what to do about it in that situation. I would try and get a hold of him in multiple ways. Call him, email him, do it multiple times. Going back to this, There is a checklist for renovations. You don't really need to worry about that too much. It basically states do as best as you can, comply with new constructions as much as possible. It's very minimal. Some of the key provisions, you do need to provide weather protection at all entrances. So typically a canopy. You do need to provide gender neutral common bathrooms, but that's, you typically have one or two of those single use or unisex bathrooms in the lobby, clubhouse, leasing office area anyway, so that's not a big of a thing. The big one is going to be minimum and maximum unit sizes. They provide very narrow windows of what those sizes are. That's the main one that people try and apply variance for. There's also minimum room sizes, such as like a 10 by 10 living room. Another one that doesn't get shown, every bedroom has to have the ability to fit 2 twin beds. That one I rarely see on drawings showing the twin beds in each of the bedrooms, but that is there to ensure that there is flexibility for larger families, for kids, extended relatives to come and stay, which happens a lot more commonly in the affordable housing projects. Also, limited number of bathrooms. For example, in a 3-bedroom unit, you have to have between 2 and 2.5 bathrooms. You can't have less than that, can't have more than that. One of the other things that's often overlooked is in the bathrooms, you need to have smart exhaust fans, whether that is via an occupancy sensor or via a humidistat. All right, the visitability requirements that are triggered by getting public funding through OHCS. Keep in mind that this is very different. I don't know if it's different. It is a different set of requirements than what is present in the A117.1. It's via this RRS. I should probably put that number up again. Most people have never seen these or looked at these. It's very easy to obtain, to meet. Basically, if you're meeting type B requirements, you got visibility covered. The only time, there's 2 situations in which these visibility requirements might come up. If you happen to have townhouses that are raised up, where the primary entrance is raised up a set of stairs, like it's on the right, and they're publicly funded, that would not be allowed. You have to have a stepless entry to every covered unit. So you're not allowed to do raised multi-story townhouses such as these. Also, if you have more than 20 units on a site, you have to have a public access common bathroom, typically at the leasing office or a clubhouse. So it's not very often that you see a large publicly funded complex that does not have an office with a common bathroom. Doesn't come up very often. This, if you do need to get a variance or an exemption from the visibility requirements, Kevin Burgee is once again the person that kind of is able to grant those. Roseanne Lynch asked a question about variance requests for OHCS for in-unit washers and dryers. OHCS actually does not require laundry within units for 3 bedrooms and more. So if you have a 3-bedroom unit or a 4-bedroom unit, you're required to have the hot and cold water shut off for future installation of washers and dryers if the tenants want that within their unit. Once again, if you don't want to provide that hot and cold water shut off in 3 and 4-bedroom units, that's when you would have to email Kevin Burgee and OHCS to get that variance. Though in my mind, that's a fairly minimal thing because it's just like a little wall Okay. Roseanne is saying that she's never gotten a response from Kevin Burgee, and once again, I'm not sure what to say about that. Rich Battaglia has also asked about smart exhaust fans. Oregon only requirement or federally, and it's only in the other states. I am not very familiar with the plumbing code or the mechanical code. I don't know if it's in there as well, but this would only be applicable where OHCS is implementing their core development standard or core development manual. So only on the state or federal funded projects within Oregon. As far as I know, Washington does not have any additional accessibility requirements for any of their funding streams. I've talked to the Department of Finance there in Washington, and they have said, yeah, we don't do anything extra. In California, you have to be very, very careful. Each funding stream will quite often have additional funding with accessibility requirements, and it depends upon the cycle of funding that you're receiving. Yeah. So if you do work in public housing in California, you gotta be really careful of those funding requirements. So I had a different slide here, and there's a woman named Lindsay who's at an architecture firm in Bend. I don't remember which one or even her last name, but she requested a flow chart to kind of explain this to help make it more clear. But I just threw this slide together several days ago in order to help it make it more clear. Let me walk you through this. The OSSC, state code, FHA. I suppose this also includes the ADA for public areas. These three codes are applicable to all residential projects, regardless of whether it gets public funding or not. If you're getting local public funding, so when I say local, meaning from the city or metro, Portland Housing Bureau, that would trigger Title II of the ADA, meaning that you would have to put in, explain what happens when you trigger the ADA in the next few slides. As far as I know, there are no current programs from Metro or Portland Housing Bureau that trigger accessibility ADA requirements. There's transit-oriented development, there's funding for solar panels on the roof, storefront improvement, programs like that, which do provide cash money, do not support are not geared towards providing low income or affordable housing, and therefore they don't trigger this. It's all about what is necessary for constructing that housing. Let's go up to the state funding down here in the bottom right. If you're getting state level funding through OHCS, and here are examples of different programs: the Oregon Rural Rehabilitation Program, Land Acquisition Program, that come from state funds and go through OHCS, they will require that use of the CDM. I'm going to skip back up over to here. There are certain programs that you apply for that funding directly from HUD and do not go through OHCS. The two biggest examples of Section 202, I think it's 202, not 212, and also Section 811, which I've never seen. Those apply directly through HUD, don't go through the state agency. You would have to apply HUD Section 504, Title II, OSSC FHA. If you get HUD funding through OHCS, and there's examples of some of those various programs that HUD gives, and it gets distributed through that state agency. you basically have to apply all the requirements. So OSSC, FHA, Title II of the ADA, you have to apply the 11 exceptions from 504, and because it's going through OHCS, you also have to apply the CDM in the bottom right corner. Hopefully that gets a little bit more clear about the different standards that have to be, or different requirements that have to be applied depending upon where that funding is coming from. All right. So what happens if you trigger Title II or the ADAS for your residential units? Typically, 5% of the units are required to be mobility units. These are slightly different from Type A requirements, and I'll go into details about how those are different. It's a little bit easier in Washington, where you already have to provide 5% Type A units, and just translating those over to mobility units, a little bit easier. In Oregon, you have to be a little more careful, where you only have to provide 2% Type A units. If you trigger a public housing, you now have to provide 5% of the mobility units. So that means you got to find an additional 3% of those units somewhere. And just to be clear, a unit can be both Type A, satisfying the state requirements, and mobility, satisfying the federal requirements. So you can overlap those, so it makes it easy. Big differences in the mobility units, you have to have 50% accessible storage in the kitchen. That gets a little bit tricky. You calculate by the square inch of the shelving or the linear inch of the facing of the shelving. Typically what we see is that the upper cabinets are at 48 inches max to the top of the bottom shelf of the upper cabinets. I think I have the next slide kind of discussing that a little bit more to give you a great example. Other key things in a mobility unit, when you have public funding, the work surface that's in the Type A / mobility unit has to be adjacent to the range. It can't be across the in an island. It has to be next to it. The other one is a little bit tricky. It's not formally defined in the code. It's something that I call a dead-end kitchen. It's the picture on the right. It's not technically a U-shaped kitchen because there's no elements at the top of the U in this particular case. So I call it a dead-end kitchen. In Type A units and Type B units, that distance between the opposing elements is allowed to be 40 inches. But if you go for public housing, the mobility units require 60 inches. This is going to be in alignment with what happens in a public space. One other thing that is pretty nuanced, if you have a mobility unit that has multiple bathrooms, under Type A, under the state code, you are only required to have a turning circle in the accessible bathroom, the first bathroom. And the second bathroom is exempt from having a turning space within it. That exception for turning spaces in the second or third and fourth bathrooms is not there in the ADA. So if you really want to be dead on strict with the ADA and mobility units, you need to have a turning space in your second bathroom in a mobility unit. Most of the time, this is overlooked. It's kind of interpreted that the ADAS is an older code, has not been updated. A117 is more up to date and reflects current kind of thoughts. And it's a very nuanced section of the code that is rarely enforced. Once again, this would be enforced by HUD. It's meeting the intention of you providing a fully accessible bathroom. Do you really need to have a second bathroom with a turning space within a single unit? Up for debate. So, how to calculate 50% accessible storage? The best, and as far as I know, only example that's in writing that's been published by the San Francisco's Mayor's Office on Disability there's this is just the first page. It's actually a 2-page published PDF. The link is in the bottom left-hand corner. And they use the area method. There's a couple of interesting interpretations that they've used that they employ on this. One is that the handles of the cabinet doors or the drawers have to be located within the reach range in order for it to be considered as accessible. This affects the upper cabinets such that if the top of the bottom shelf of the upper cabinet is at 48 inches or 46 inches, depending on the depth of the cabinet, that handle also has to be all the way at the bottom. You can't locate it an inch up in order to have it look nice. But this is a San Francisco interpretation. That's what is required there in that particular city. The other interesting one is in upper cabinets, you have to have a movable shelf, and that has to count to that calculation. So you can't just provide a full height upper cabinet with no movable interior shelf. Oh, one other thing I should note, when you are calculating the 50% accessible storage, you cannot count the removable cabinets underneath the sink and the work surface because it's assumed that they're going to be removed. I suppose one other thing about this, this is kind of an example of checking off a box. This requirement is only in the ADAS. Once again, that is 14 years old at this point. It is not in the state code. It's not in the FHA. It's solely in this code. It's a single line. A lot of people really want this to go away. Is it important to provide accessible storage for people in wheelchairs? Yes. But one of the first things that first accommodations or modifications that people do is get a reach extender so they can reach things in higher cabinets. There's also a whole bunch of aftermarket products that enhance the reach ranges of cabinets. So shelving that kind of comes out of an upper cabinet and drops down, making it easier to reach everything. There's so many different products out there, albeit they're all fairly expensive to install. Yeah, leave that there. The other thing that's required by public housing or public is communication units, and communications units may or may not be required depending upon the state. They are not required at the state level in Oregon, but I believe they are in Washington. It depends upon whether Appendix E of the IBC has been adopted by that particular state. Communication units requirements under the ADA are pretty much identical to those at the state level. Typically, 2% of the units in public housing are required to be communication units. Be careful because it's a higher percentage in transient housing, so hotels, places like that. They do not have to overlap with mobility units. Under transient housing, the requirement is that there has to be at least one communication unit that is also a mobility unit, but a maximum 10%. We recommend going with that same guidance. There are people that are out there that are both blind, that have mobility issues and are blind and are deaf, especially in the elder communities. But we recommend separating them out as much as possible. So what's required for communication unit? Instead of just having a horn fire alarm, you have to have a strobe as well. You also, if you have a, what are they called? Door King, where you have the building entry device, that's at the main entry to the building. If it has an audible component, then you also have to have a visual one. This is not very well enforced, as that technology is just now kind of starting to come along. They're a lot more expensive to have that video interface. You have to have a visual doorbell at the entry to the unit, communication units. If it's a studio apartment and where that visual doorbell is located in the same room as the sleeping area, then you need to have a power shut off for that. So that way kids or other people can't push the doorbell in the middle of the night and wake you up. You also have to have a peephole. If you do have a peephole on a mobility unit, it has to be within the reach range. I recommend at 43 inches instead of 48. And then technically you also need to have a TTY station within the communication units. Typically this is just an available outlet, and somewhere close to that is a 10-inch shelf. Technically that 10-inch shelf has to be built in to the unit, and it has to be a permanent fixture. This is rarely done for numerous reasons. One is the TTY stations, which is short for teletype. There's a picture of one on the right hand side. Very few people still use TTYs. It's typically people that are around 60 or older, who are kind of grew up using that technology. Give it another like 15-20 years and they probably won't be used ever again. And it'll be a vestige of the 8AS and its kind of age. The other reason is that 10-inch shelf, it's so easy to just provide like some aftermarket little telephone stand shelf, screw it to the wall, easy to attach afterwards or upon request. So people don't usually build them in. Yeah. All right, challenges in public housing. Probably the biggest one is trying to find out what funding sources are being used, and they may not be known by the time you're designing. Unfortunately, it's pretty common that you're designing a multifamily housing, and then halfway through, or maybe even late in the design process, you find out that they're deciding to go after public funding, and therefore it changes the number of type A mobility units. If you can, find out what the funding sources are as early as possible to help kind of you understand what is that basis of design. So you can do that from your early concept phases. Now, the key thing is trying to find out what I like to call them accessibility riders. So what additional accessibility requirements are put in place by either the funding stream or one of the pass-through state agencies. What gets tricky sometimes is that the local agencies may or may not know what these accessibility requirements are. Portland Housing Bureau actually had in place, and it might still be in place, that they will not advise you on any accessibility requirements related to the built environment, even though they may be providing funding for it. They don't want to be liable, so they put all that liability on the architects for knowing what's required, and they will not tell you what's required, which is a little crazy. That is slowly starting to change. There's a woman there at Portland Housing Bureau that's knows your stuff and is starting to kind of influence that side a little bit. So just be careful that don't rely solely on the housing agency, because they may or may not know. I highly recommend documenting your compliance with both federal standards as well as public funding standards in your code sheets and in your documents. So that way, not only does it kind of document that you are in compliance with those, but it helps the reviewer, such as myself, know that you know what you're doing, and have included those. It helps train any junior staff to kind of ask questions and know that these types of things should be included as well. Kind of helps train that younger generation. Be aware also of lawsuits that have happened. The highest profile one is in the city of LA, where they've gotten sued 3 times by HUD for not enforcing the HUD requirements. So rather than doing those 5% mobility units, they actually have to provide 13% mobility units in order to make up for all the ones they've missed over the last several decades. So there might be some local requirements that are not attached to public funding, but are due to lawsuits. There's a program that DOJ and HUD kind of work on called Project Civic Access, where they sue particular jurisdictions or entities that are not complying with federal requirements. Ashland has been sued. Bend, the kind of Deschutes and Tillamook County. Those are the ones that I'm aware of in Oregon. There's the 3 up in Washington. A lot of times these lawsuits are about public right of way, but they have this effect of scaring the jurisdiction enough that they become very knowledgeable and very strict about enforcing accessible lighting requirements, specifically in Bend. So Bend is a tough one. Other jurisdictions that are aware of accessibility, Seattle. That's mainly because there's a woman named Karen Breitmeyer of Studio Pacifica who consults with City of Seattle all the time, and they're kind of taking a little bit more of a progressive activist lens in how they interpret accessibility. Lake Oswego now has a person on staff who is very knowledgeable about accessibility, and for that, I have to personally apologize because I trained her at our company before she went to the dark side. And so she will challenge you in Lake Oswego. Portland is also becoming more and more aware of accessibility, probably through our own efforts and kind of like talking with them and educating them. They're becoming more aware, so we're starting to see some of these inspectors from the city of Portland questioning some accessibility elements as well. All right, that is the end of that section. Does anybody have questions about public housing or publicly funded housing? Okay. Well, let's get into the basics of accessibility then. All right. So these are the basics. This is what we're going to talk about over the next hour or so. We'll see if we can get to those public bathrooms within the next hour or two. See how the timing goes. Anyone know like why that's an accessibility fail in the picture on the right hand side? Out of curiosity. I'm not going to wait for answers. So this is a beautifully designed sign that's got full of tactile elements. It's got braille, and they put this nice sheet of plastic over the top in order to protect it from the weather, so you can't actually feel anything. So it's there, but yeah, as Spencer said, you can't. It's there, but you can't actually use any of it. See this all the time in various places. Okay, let's get into basic concepts. Key things, 2017 A117.1 changes. Just want to run through these. This is a quick little summary of what has changed in Oregon and will be coming to Washington sometime very soon. Chapters 10 and 11 have been reversed. In the 2009 version, 10 was residential, and 11 was recreational elements. Those have been reversed. It's more to be in alignment with the ADAS, but what it means is that you have to change all the code references on all of your standard accessibility sheets. Yeah. Larger clear floor spaces, larger turning circles, more options for T-shaped turning spaces, and there's implications of all those things all the way throughout new construction, and those have been worked into all of the upcoming stuff. Tolerances. Technically, there are tolerances allowed by the code. If you have a minimum, a maximum, or a specific measurement. However, these are industry standard tolerances which are not defined. And they're arguable as to what they are. So, like, what is the tolerance on providing a 30 by 48 clear floor space beyond the swing of a door? Nobody knows. Is there an industry standard that's been published for that? No. So do not rely on these tolerances. One of the biggest things you can do to help accessibility go smoothly on a project is to build in tolerances into your drawings. Places where that is critical is going to be in your hallway widths. I was just on a project a couple days ago where they had a hallway that was at 35.5 inches and instead of 36, and that was because of baseboard. And they did not really want to swap out their baseboard. It was really hard to fix. Clear floor space beyond the swing of a door in a bathroom. Problem is that you don't really know if you meet it until everything is installed, and at that point in time, it's really difficult to fix. And bathrooms are always really tight. There's examples of other places where you might want to include some tolerances into your drawings as well. Okay, number of accessible parking spots. So the reason why I have the slash symbol on the table is just to give you awareness that this table does not apply to multifamily residential. A lot of people really try to apply that to all the residential parking. This is the wrong table. In Oregon, you apply 2%. In Washington, 5%. Parking spaces need to be accessible. There's a little bit of caveat there. The number of parking, this table is applicable to the public parking spaces within a multifamily residential. So if you have a leasing office and you have dedicated visitor parking, that's when you would apply this table to those visitor parking spaces. Also, be careful if you're doing any sort of healthcare occupancy, whether that is a B ambulatory or a full I2 occupancy. Outpatient, hospital outpatient requires 10% accessible parking, and rehabilitation or physical therapy requires 20%. Gets very, very complicated, especially in hospital situations when you have mixed occupancies. Say you have a rehabilitation clinic within a hospital, but then none of that parking is dedicated solely to the rehabilitation clinic. So how do you calculate that mixed ratio amongst your entire parking lot for your entire campus? It's really tricky. Yeah. In Oregon, parking is regulated by the Oregon Transportation Commission. Well, it's not regulated. The standard for parking was developed by the Oregon Transportation Commission. That's in an effort to align what is happening within the project boundary versus what is happening within the public right of way. So Oregon just references the OTC standards. In Oregon, the space width is 9 feet wide. For a standard accessible space, the aisle is 6 feet wide. For a van or wheelchair accessible space, it's 8 feet wide. This is different from Washington. In Washington, the space width is 8 feet. The accessible car aisle can be decreased down to 5 feet. So be careful about which state you're working in and what size you have. What is the same for both states is that the dimension is measured to the center of line to center of line, unless it's at the end of the row, in which case it's usually measured up to a curve. The vertical clearance you have to be careful of with vans. So it requires a 98 inch, so that's 8 feet 2 inch high clearance for van accessible parking spaces. It's not only just the parking space itself, but the entire route from the public right of way to that van accessible spot and back out to the right of way again. Where I usually see it running into issues is at carports. Standard carport height is 8 feet, which is not 2 inches short of being compliant for a van accessible parking space. aisle location had to be on the right hand side of a single accessible space that is no longer required except for passenger side. It's required on the passenger side for angled van spaces. Don't see those incredibly often, except at maybe kind of strip malls where you have tighter parking lot locations. Also, wheel stops, they're not explicitly regulated, but kind of recommend them whenever such as in the picture on the right, where you have a parking space that is adjacent to an accessible route and the car overhang might decrease the width of that accessible route. That is the link for the OTC standards if you ever want to go find out what it is and read them. Recommend downloading them. Kind of newer things as of August 2019. I suppose that's 5 years old now. Some people still are not aware of this, but the aisles have to be marked for no parking. This is based upon what's been happening in California, where motorcycles have been parking in the accessible aisles. So they want to make it a lot more explicit. You do, for the most part, you do not need to install the signs at the bottom that are the post-mounted signs indicating no parking in the aisle. Those are only required where there's snow or sand regularly present, so that way you will not be able to read the marking that is on the pavement. I'm not sure, but I believe that Bend might be requiring these post-mounted signs. Part of this is due to how much snow is there on a regular basis, plus how kind of strict and conservative they are in terms of accessibility. If anybody is aware whether these are required in Bend or not, let me know. Parking signage. Oregon transportation requirement requires the newer signs, which are white background with a green legend. They have to be separate signage. So you have a standard parking sign, then underneath that you have the van accessible. Underneath that you have a wheelchair user only if you have 6 or more spaces. Neither of the signs on the right are quite correct. It's kind of like somewhere in between. The signs need to have the coloration on the right hand side as on the right hand side, but they need to be separated as in the left hand side. Is anyone going to really harass you because you don't have exactly the right signage? Probably only on the drive-by lawsuits. Yeah. Sign height. The requirement is that it is 60 inches to the bottommost sign, and that's measured from the parking space, not from where the sign is, the ground where the sign is located. If it's on a post, in Oregon, it has to be 84 inches. This comes from the OTC standards. In Washington, it's only 80 inches, which comes from the standard head height for accessibility. Okay, Seth Anderson says, yes, they are requiring those post-mounted signs for the aisles, but it depends on the reviewer. It's up to the discretion of the jurisdiction based upon how much snow they really get. I would assume up in the government camp, they would also be required just because of definitely a bit like Mount Bachelor. Yeah. Parking symbols. This is coming up. I'm actually a big fan of this new parking symbol, the one that's kind of centered. It's called the dynamic accessibility symbol. The older one is seen in the bottom right, has been around for 60 years, 70 years now. What's interesting is that the old one is still required by the ADA, and they've actually issued formal interpretations that this new dynamic symbol is not acceptable according to federal standards. However, this new symbol is required by New York State and Connecticut and Florida. And so there's this tension between two different symbols. I would recommend going with the new dynamic symbol everywhere where the traditional old symbol is not explicitly required, but you are wanting to install it. I think this newer symbol is better. It's been developed by the community and adopted by the disability community, and they want to push it that way. I have another question. Melissa has asked if the height measurements on this last slide are measured. Where are they measured to? It's measured to the bottom of the sign. And it's the bottom of the bottommost sign, depending on which sign you have. All right. Accessible parking location. Oregon and IBC basically says that it has to be on the shortest route possible, practical route possible. That is somewhat subjective. The key word is the practical, shortest practical route. And that I'm going to leave up to you designers and architects to kind of decide what is practical and what is not. If you do have multiple entrances, such as like at a hospital or a strip mall or even like a residential facility that has multiple entrances, if you have multiple accessibility parking spaces, they should be distributed amongst the various entrances. How they get distributed, do you put like 5 over here and 2 on the other by the other entrance? The quantity of the distribution is very subjective, but they should be somewhat distributed. Other key things: accessible aisles shall not overlap a vehicular right of way. So this typically happens when an accessible parking space is at the end of an aisle or end of a row. The aisle can't overlap a drive aisle. Or when you have a parallel space, the aisle can't be located within the drive aisle itself. Please do not provide any sort of accessible parking, such as in the drawing on the right. It's probably one of the worst examples I've seen, and my sincere apologies if anybody in this room is the one that provided us with this drawing. Don't do that. Striping is all weird and wacky. You can't mark things in the drive aisle. One of the accessible parking spaces doesn't even have an attached aisle. Yeah, it's all sorts of weird. Oh, do I have this mentioned on the next slide? Or do I mention? Nope, I don't have it. I should probably mention it here. When are accessible routes required to be striped? When they cross a drive aisle, such as in here. So, for example, you're going from an accessible parking space across a drive aisle to an elevator entrance in a parking garage. In Washington, when it crosses that drive aisle, it's required to be striped. In Oregon, it is not. And we recommend that you actually don't stripe it if you are allowed to. part of that has to do with awareness. When you have an accessible IR route that is striped, it provides an illusion of safety. Like, oh, I can cross the street. Cars are going to stop for me. They're going to see this aisle here. That is not necessarily always the case. When a person in a wheelchair does not have a clearly marked pathway, they tend to be a lot more aware of their surroundings and a lot more careful about what the potential dangers are. And this is kind of coming out of a Dutch kind of planning research that has happened, that the less signage that you provide, the more people are aware of their surroundings and have to be aware. Though there's a finite, this gets in universal design, but question of like, how do you provide enough information but not too much information? What do people need to know without providing this, getting into this realm of illusion of safety? Interesting topic. All right, passenger loading zones. Where are they required? Every covered entrance to a long-term medical facility. So you'll see them at pretty much every hospital. Wherever there is valet service. So you have to have a loading zone in order to exchange to let the valet get out of your car, let the valet get in, and be able to drive it off to wherever they're going. At public mechanical parking garages, but not necessarily at private mechanical parking garages. When I say mechanical, I'm talking about the stackers. And whenever passenger loading zones are provided, you need to provide an accessible one. This is they're optional, but typically provided at transit facilities such as the airport, bus stations, also at education. Schools, specifically K through 8, also at elder care facilities. So assisted living, independent living. The loading zone needs to be the 96 inches wide. That includes that. Does that include 67? 96 inches wide, 20 feet long. That 20 feet long is a little bit changed in the new version of the code, similar to how the length of parking spaces is specified by the local zoning code and not by the accessibility code. The new 2017 version of the A117 has kind of crossed out that 20 feet long. Theoretically, the zoning code is going to specify how long those are, but I'm not sure if building planners are really aware of that responsibility that the building code is placed on them. So at this point, I would still recommend going a minimum 20 feet long to be consistent with what has been historical. You also need to have one loading zone every 100 feet. This usually comes up at, once again, transit facilities and schools. Be really careful with circular loading zones. The 100 feet can easily be hit with a circular loading zone, depending upon the radius of that circle. And so you might need to have two accessible ones there. Okay, the aisle needs to be marked as to discourage it. It doesn't necessarily need to be striped. What does that marking mean is a little bit more subjective. Some people elect to do just a different sort of paving. Some people decide to just put enough signage there in order to say don't park here, and that can be a post-mounted sign. But that's a little subjective. I recommend striping it just to make it really obvious and consistent with the rest of the accessible parking type of symbology. In the new 2017 A117, the new accessible aisle has to be 67 inches wide instead of 60 inches wide. It technically is not a turning space within the aisle, but people turn a lot. And so that's why it's increased in size. Other key thing to keep in mind is route height. similar to the van accessible parking spaces that required a minimum height, because loading zones are assumed to have those public paratransit vans or buses kind of stopping in and going through these spaces to let people on and off. There's an increased height, so it goes up to 114 inches. So that's, I'm gonna let you guys do the math of how many feet that is. What, 11 and a half feet, somewhere there? All right, accessible routes within a site. This was a shopping complex that I reviewed out in Gresham, the name right there, Gresham Station. Due to site constraints, the bus stop was all the way down in the bottom right-hand corner. And the only accessible route to the building in the bottom right was to go all the way around the entire parking lot, because there was a steep grade in between the transit stop and that first building on the bottom right. Not really compliant. Yeah, you have to provide that accessible route from the transit and the public right of way, and it really should be what I call co-located or located in the same area and be approximately the same distance as the non-accessible route. So not a great example. You also have to provide accessible routes between the accessible parking spaces and the entrances. This is a great example of, you can kind of see the striped aisles and see that they're kind of distributed all along the outside of the facility adjacent to each building. They had a little, due to the number of required number of spaces, they also located a couple in the interior underneath that red circle. So they have to be careful about providing an accessible route between those two spaces across the drive aisle to the building at the top. Yep. You also have to provide accessible routes between each of the buildings. Doesn't necessarily have to cross through the parking lot. Okay, accessible routes, minimum of 36 inches wide. Let me throw in a caveat here. There was a new change in the 2017 A117. Exterior accessible routes have to be 48 inches wide. I'll put this in the presentation before I send it out. So that affects exterior accessible routes. They have to be wider. Typically, sidewalks are either 4 or 5 feet wide, occasionally up to 6. So it's not usually too big of an issue. Sometimes that comes up in multifamily complexes when you have, say, a sidewalk that goes to an individual townhouse or duplex. So it can be effective there. That accessible route can be reduced down to 32 inches for a maximum of 2 feet, as shown in this diagram. One minor change due to the new 2017 A117.1, that distance between obstructions has now increased from 48 to 52 inches because of the expansion of the clear floor space. Also note that when you are measuring the clear width of hallways, because it says clear width, that does not include the baseboards. This is a matter of some debate, but it also depends upon how the size and shape of the wheelchair and how the wheels are designed, all that kind of stuff. In order to be safe, measure between the baseboards. In the 2017, there's also a new, there are requirements for doing 180 returns. There is a new third option for that. I want you to keep in mind that this 180 return is not applicable at ramp landings. It is applicable where do we usually see it? Doorless bathrooms. So at like airports, train stations, we see it in bookstores and libraries where you're kind of moving from one stack to the next. We also see it in queuing lines at airports, security gates, security points, movie theaters, things along those types of spaces. What is new and is now in the 2017 is 90-degree turns. Once again, we see this in doorless bathrooms, residential facilities. Hopefully you're not designing 36-inch corridors, but basically you're not allowed to do a 36-inch to 36-inch corridor. You have to either do like 38 to 42, 36 to 44. Those are those options 3 and 4. Highly recommend that you don't do option 1 or 2 because it's just going to be more of a pain for the framers and the sheetrockers. Along various walking routes, and keep in mind I want to differentiate that this is not along an accessible route but along a circulation path, which is anywhere where somebody might reasonably walk. You have to deal with obstructions along that path. Anything that is located between a height of 27 inches and 80 inches and sticks out more than 4 inches is considered an obstruction, and you definitely need to have a cane guard underneath. So where does this come up? Under stairs, fire extinguishers, AEDs, dispensers, sprinkler riser valves and stairwells. Basically, any of those last little things that get stuck on the walls at the very end of a project and are last minute. Okay, getting into ramps. What is a ramp? What is a walking surface? So pretty much any cross slope. So anything that is perpendicular to the direction of travel, you're limited to a 1 to 48 slope or about a 2% grade. It's actually 2.033, but most people ignore the 33 and just say 2%. This same slope is also going to be applicable at all clear floor spaces and door maneuvering clearances as well. Routes. So along a particular walking route, you are limited to a 5% grade or 1 to 20 slope. If you go above that, then it's considered a ramp. A ramp is anything that is in between 5% and 8.3%. Maximum pitch of 1 to 12. There is a provision within the code for a pedestrian ramp that is allowed to go steeper. I highly recommend that you don't rely on that. That's what's allowed for a ramp along a non-accessible route. And I would encourage you, don't even look at it, don't think about it. Also, I've not included in here any slopes for ramps in existing buildings, of which there are some slightly steeper slopes that are allowed for very short distances. Also within the accessible route, the maximum change in level is going to be a 1/2 inch. And that's typically with a bevel. Where it sometimes gets a little bit trickier is you get like the surface mounted lights that are in the sidewalk. It becomes a maintenance issue. The other place it gets a little bit confusing is going to be at sliding doors. You are allowed to have 3/4 of an inch change in level at the threshold for a sliding door, but only within residential units. If you have a sliding door in a public area, you're still limited to that 1/2 inch, which basically means you're going to be insetting that sliding door jamb into the floor. All right, getting into the turning circles. One of the biggest misconceptions about turning spaces and turning circles T-shaped is that they're required in every room. And that is not true. This is the full list of where turning spaces are required. In every room in an accessible unit, that's for transient, like hotels, monasteries, Airbnbs, kind of thing. Also in every room in a type A unit, in all bathrooms, not necessarily in the bathroom stalls, just one in the bathroom, in saunas, changing rooms, and in between doors in a series. In Oregon, there's also a turning space required at an exterior clustered mailbox that's of a weird dimension. That is a 6 foot or a 72-inch turning space. That's a weird outlier in Oregon. But for the most part, this is the full list of where turning spaces are required. They're not required in every room. They're not required in mail rooms. They're not required in trash chute rooms. However, I recommend that you put them in every room. Most people have used a turning circle as the kind of the standard. T-shaped turning spaces were rarely used previously. Under the 2017, they're going to become more common, and I'll show you why in a minute. They have increased in size from 60 inches to 67 inches. But also one of the lesser known things is that before you were able to kind of have that turning circle located underneath an obstruction. You could have it like in the bathroom. You could have the turning circle go underneath the sink and make use of the full knee and toe space up to 24 inches. But that amount of overlap has been reduced. The maximum amount of overlap that you can have a turning circle go underneath an obstruction at this under the new code is going to be 10 inches or slightly more than that toe space. Also keep in mind that you can only have that obstruction, have the turning space under the obstruction on a one side. You can't have it all the way around the circle or on multiple sides. In T-shaped turning spaces, there are now 3 options instead of 1. Option 1 in the bottom right-hand corner was the original T-shaped space, but now there's 3 in order to provide more flexibility. May be useful in more spaces. So I wanted to compare the T-shaped turning space, option 2, to the turning space. Note that the T-shaped turning space is 60 inches deep, where the turning circle is 67 inches deep. Therefore, you can use the turning space, the new turning space, in smaller spaces. So when you're talking really tight bathrooms or kitchens or walk-in closets, it might be more beneficial to use the T-shaped space. One of the catches on this is at the bottom, the bottom of the T has to be 42 inches across. Where this comes into play is, say, in a bathroom and you want to have one length or the base of the T located under a sink. Sinks are typically sink cabinets are typically 30 or 36 inches wide. So in order to locate this T-shaped turning space under a sink, you have to make sure you have a 42-inch wide clear floor space underneath that sink. So there's some caveats. You can get a smaller space in the bathroom, but you have to have a wider open space underneath the sink. But consider that. Knee and toe spaces. Hopefully everyone is familiar with this particular diagram. Not going to go into it too much. The one thing that I really want to mention here is that at the front line of the toe space has to be aligned with the controls. A lot of times people will put in the minimum knee and toe space underneath the sink, such that the toe space is not aligned with the faucet controls, but it has to be. So that 8 inches minimum for the knee space quite often is more than 8 inches. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Clear floor spaces have also increased in size. They used to be 30 by 48 inches. They have increased to 30 by 52 for new construction. When you get into multifamily residential, it gets a little bit tricky. So that 30 by 52 is required for public spaces, new construction, and also type A units, but not for type B units. Type B units still use the 30 by 48. And I'll kind of reference that a little bit more once we get into the units. Other things to think about, parallel versus forward approaches. We're going to talk about each of those at different appliances and where each of them is required. Especially when you're doing a clear floor space beyond the swing of a door, please do not, stick in a diagonal clear floor space beyond the swing of the bathroom door. Makes it really hard. I know it's hard in tight bathrooms, but try not to do that. Other things, can anything stick into a clear floor space, such as handles, baseboards, towel bars, countertops? The only one that's legally allowed is handles. So cabinet handles from ranges, dishwashers, cabinets can stick in there. Baseboards, towel bars, countertops all have to be, well, countertops there's a little bit in type B units, so it's allowed to stick up to 1.5 inches within that. But for the most part, no other obstructions are allowed within that clear floor space. Also be careful about alcove conditions. They have increased requirements. So, for example, on the right in the bathroom, typical bathroom plan, this sink is an alcove. Because the width of that space is, or the depth of that space is deeper than 24 inches, the sink width has to be 36 because an alcove is shown on the upper right and left. One thing to keep in mind is that with the longer clear floor space, the depth of the alcove remains at 24 inches. It has not been increased to 26 inches. All right, reach ranges. Parallel approach, side reach. A lot of times it can be centered or offset, depends on the code and the appliance. You have the big thing to remember. The two big things to remember is you have a 24-inch max reach range. If you're reaching over an obstruction, this is what happens in type A units at counters. Generally, the reach range is 15 to 48. If it is over that obstruction, it drops to 46. Yeah. If you do a forward approach, you're not allowed to reach over solid obstructions at all. This is where that alignment of the knee and toe space with the controls at a kitchen sink comes in. You're not allowed to reach past your toes. You do have to imply, if you are reaching over an obstruction, you do have to provide that knee and toe space. In the bottom right kind of shows that. Please ignore this diagram, the fact that this person has extraordinarily long arms and are reaching past their toes. That diagram is incorrect. You're not allowed to reach past your toes. Maximum depth of the obstruction increases to 25 inches, but also the reach range when you're doing a forward approach drops down to 44 inches instead of 46 inches. So be aware of that. It comes up occasionally when you have outlets over work surfaces. Door maneuvering clearances. These are some of the door maneuvering clearances. There's tons of them. Things to take into account: forward approach, parallel approach. Are you on the push side of the door, the pull side of the door? Are you approaching from the latch side or the hinge side? There are two minor changes in the 2017 version. This forward approach has increased from 48 inches up to 52 inches, but because it's a forward approach to the door, you're generally going to have that extra 4 inches anyway. The other one is this particular diagram. When you're approaching on the hinge side, push side of the door, they are no longer requiring the 12 inches beyond the door. So it makes it a little bit easier. This usually comes up when you have a double loaded corridor and you have a door on each side at the very end of the corridor. Comes up in residential or offices. I'm going to address mainly these two. Hopefully everybody knows these two door maneuvering clearances. They're the most common ones. Forward approach needs to be 60 inches deep, 18 inches on the side for all doors. If you're on the push side, remember it's 52 inches now. Except inside, yeah, even at your type B units because it's at the entry. But it has to be 52 inches forward approach, 12 inches on the side if it has a latch and a closer. If you don't have a latch and a closer, you don't need to have that 12-inch side clearance. Be careful of obstructions within this 18-inch space, such as like an adjacent stair handrail. Like this picture right here. So if you're inside of a stairwell, you're using the stairwell as a pass-through for the exterior, you are only allowed to have a maximum 8-inch depth to that recess before you have to have the side clearance. So that condition in the picture is non-compliant. Watch out for the 8-inch depth. Also, if you are doing shear walls or suppose it's a demising wall between adjacent townhouse units or walk-up units, generally a 2x6 wall will give you still less than that 8-inch depth adjacent to the door. But once you get up to a 2x8 wall, that's when you start getting more than that 8-inch depth. All right, curb ramps. I'm not going to talk too much about curb ramps because this is typically within the realm of the civil engineer, but just to kind of give you a heads up as to what you need to be aware of so that way your civil is taking this into account. Tactile warning strips are previously were not required anywhere within a project site, even at curb ramps, unless you had a street, not necessarily within a parking lot, but within a street within your project site. We generally recommend that you provide as few tactile warnings as possible. They are really helpful for people who are blind, that to alert them that they're kind of about to enter in a place where there is traffic moving at speed. And the at speed is the critical part. Civil engineers tend to put them at every single curb ramp of every single type. When you have it at a curb ramp that leads from a sidewalk to an accessible aisle, they're not even entering traffic at that point. And so why is that tactile warning there? And tactile warnings are more difficult for people with crutches, people in wheelchairs, the elderly. These are the populations that are going to be using the accessible parking spaces. And for them to traverse that tactile warning strip, it actually is a slip, trip, and fall hazard. A little bit on the fence about including tactile warnings within parking lots. Cars are not traveling at speed there and are theoretically aware of pedestrians. Pedestrians are also aware that they're in a parking lot. So that way they have to pay attention for cars in the drive aisles. It's really only at public streets and interior streets as well where these are required. There's a whole bunch of new types of curb ramps. that are in the A1 17.1, but all of these curb ramps have been in the civil engineering kind of portfolio for a long time as part of engineering drawings or as a document called PROAG, Public Right-of-Way Accessibility Guidelines. They're just kind of bringing those into the site as well. Just to kind of give you some like terminology, there's something called a parallel curb ramp. The typical one that we saw in the last slide is called a perpendicular curb ramp. It's parallels where you go in and then go up parallel to the sidewalk. There's also blended transitions in the bottom left where the entire corner has been dropped to the level of the street. And there's also something known as constrained ramps, which is in the bottom right, where you have a ramp or a flare on one side, but a curb on the other. And that affects the landing depth. Once again, should all be in the realm of your civil engineers, but it would be good for you to know about it, to kind of double check your civils. Ramps. So 1 to 20 to 1 to 12 in the direction of travel, 1 to 48 cross slope. We kind of covered that when we were talking about walking surfaces and general slopes. Some new information. Hopefully you know that the maximum rise on a ramp is 30 inches in change in elevation. Otherwise, you need to have an intermediate landing. You also need to have landings on the top and bottom. Any change in direction requires the landing. If that ramp rises more than 6 inches, then you're required to have handrails. If it's less than 6 inches, it's your choice about whether you have handrails or not. If you do not have handrails, there's a little known provision. It's hidden in a weird place in the IBC/OSSC. It's under general means of egress in section 1003, I believe. That says if you do not have handrails on a ramp that is 6 inches or less, you need to have a contrasting surface in order to warn people who are low vision. That's rarely enforced. I've only ever seen it enforced by I don't know if it was Hillsborough or Washington County, one of the two. Yeah. But it's good whenever you have that kind of transition to kind of mark it. As to what is suitable contrasting surface, that is a whole separate discussion. I've already included that. I guess put it in there twice. Landing size. You need to have a clear length of 60 inches at a landing. Note that this has not increased to 67 inches with the new turning space. That's because the turning space is no longer required at a landing. It used to be tied to the sides of the landing space. Now they're just saying it has to be 60 by 60. Once again, reiterating that these 180-degree and 90-degree ramp landings are not regulated by those 180 and 90-degree turn dimensions that we talked about earlier. One of the other debates that kind of happens within accessibility world is are handrails or guards allowed to be within the 60-inch by 60-inch minimum clear landing space? The technical official answer is no, but it's a very common practice that the pad is 60 inches by 60 inches and the handrails and guards are kind of within that. Down in California, I pay a lot more attention to that. It's a little bit looser up here in Oregon. All right, edge protection. On ramps, you need to have either a 4-inch curb or a barrier at 4 inches or less in the handrail. So that way, a person with a crutch, as they're walking up and down the ramp, doesn't necessarily slip out off the edge of the ramp underneath the handrail. One of the alternate options is you can provide a 12-inch extension outside of the handrail instead of that 4-inch curb. This applies at landings too. So this picture on the right that I just kind of put in here, Anyone notice that there's Braille up to floor 9, but floors 10 through 13, and that mysterious 0 floor? Or is that the roof? Not sure what that is. Doesn't have Braille. I thought that was a curious image. Just another one of those. Oh, and most likely nobody's going to be able to reach this number pad either. Those are typically over the height. Okay, stairs as part of a public means of egress. The reason why I'm putting that in there is stairs in the OSSC and the A117 are, even though they're written in the A117, are not applicable to any project. So those stair requirements there, ignore them. This can get into a little bit of an interesting topic debate about scoping. There is no actual scoping section that points to the stair requirements in the A117.1. And that's why they're not applicable. The only stairs that are regulated are actually under the ADAS. Under the ADA, they state that any stairs that are part of the public means of egress or have to meet the accessibility requirements. So they are scoped under the ADA, not under the A117.1. Probably the big implication on this is that you do not have to provide contrasting nosing at any stairs, because that contrasting nosing requirement is only in the A117.1, which is not scoped. It's not in the ADA. However, once again, I would recommend putting contrasting nosing at least the top and bottom riser. You don't necessarily have to put it at every riser. As people walk up and down stairs, they will very quickly get the rhythm of going up and down the stairs, and so they don't necessarily need to see every single stair or every single riser. All right, so what is a stairway? It's more than one riser. There's a major exception within the code that if you only have a single riser and you have a clear floor space, actually I think it's a landing, 60 inches on each side of that riser, you don't need to have a handrail, and it's not really a stairwell at that point. Risers have to be between 4 and 7 inches. They cannot be open if they are part of that public means of egress. In residential facilities, they can be open, but I highly recommend that they not be open. It causes tripping and broken ankle hazards. Runs have to be at least 11 inches or more. Handrails on both sides. And once again, that's only if the rise is more than 6 inches. This is Pioneer Courthouse Square, who we all know and love as Portland's living room. It's also a great example of what's known as a stramp or a stair ramp. They're really nice architectural features. Most people in wheelchairs are not going to use that thing. People with vision issues, it's really rough on them. It presents all sorts of tripping hazards, especially when there's no contrast in the materials. It is legal to do it in Pioneer Courthouse Square because there is an accessible route all the way around the exterior of the block. And therefore, this is a convenience stramp as compared to a required stramp or required accessible route. Oh, I got a question. I am a single step will. I'm getting a question about whether a single step requires a handrail, and typically a single step might require a handrail, but it's relatively easy to provide that 60 inches on each side of the step, and it's like a big, easy to meet exception where you don't have to provide a handrail. And that's assuming that you have an accessible route that is an alternate to that step. This usually comes up in like restaurants or existing buildings where you have level changes. And there is an exception in restaurants in which you can have areas of the restaurant that are at different heights, and you don't necessarily need to provide a handrail there. If you have 2 steps, you definitely require a handrail. And then the other place where we see a bunch of single steps is in employee work areas. And in that case, if it's under that 1,000 square feet, then it's not a route. Yeah, the handrail gets exempted. Yep. Hopefully that answers your question. It tends to be a little bit more of a case-by-case basis, depending upon if there's an accessible elsewhere, employee work area, how much space do you have on each side. All right, handrails, 34 to 38 inches. Going back to that UFIS, I made comments about that earlier. UFIS requires that handrail tops are a minimum of 38. I think it's like 38 to 40 inches. And so that's what makes it really hard to, one of the reasons why it makes it really hard to use UFIS. Handrails have to be an inch and a half from a wall if they're adjacent to a wall. Grab bars totally have to be an inch and a half away. At a ramp, well, ramps and stairs, you have to have a 12-inch horizontal extension. At the bottom, it's either, if you're at stairs, it's 1 tread depth, or typically 11 inches. Most people generally go for 12 inches. If you're at a ramp, it's going to be a 12-inch horizontal. And talking about continuous and returns, these extensions have to be in the direction of travel. This gets a little complicated when you're in a stairwell, say at the top of a stair, and you have a full stair landing, and you just want to do an immediate 90-degree turn on it. Can't do that. They have to go 12 inches in the direction of travel. There's also some confusion about how do you measure that 12 inches. If you take a look at the ramp diagram, it measures it to the inside of the downward turn on that handrail. And if you take a look at the stair ramp in the bottom right, it measures it to the outside of that downturn. To be safe, I would measure it to the inside. Monumental stairs. This is often confusing. Handrails, generally you put the handrails where the most of the traffic is. And the handrail has to accommodate all occupants within 30 inches of a handrail. The general rule of thumb is that if you have a 60-inch wide space, you put an intermediate handrail in. But that's not necessarily always true. It's dependent upon the occupant load. But generally, you put them where people are traveling. And if that space is wider than 60 inches and you have a high occupant load, then you will need to have an intermediate. Don't put them all the way at the edges on a monumental stair like this, where that's not super helpful. Okay. It is now 11:30. Running a little bit slow, but let's take our half-an-hour break and we will start up the second session, and I will run through public bathrooms and residential bathrooms and kitchens, and then do an hour on an introduction to universal design. Oh, I have one final question right here. Oh, that's not a question. That's Colleen making sure to sign into the other link for the afternoon session.
Thanks, Joshua.
Yeah.
Okay, everyone, enjoy your break, and we will see you back in a different Zoom link at noon.
Okay.
Bye, all.